Hi everyone, my name is Katie Pryor and I am going to speak to you about a commercial lease that I created for my fictional client, Don Curlehan's, a cafe bar situated in the fictional city of Curlehan in California. Too often the landlord-tenant relationship is unbalanced, with all the power on the side of the unscrupulous landlords. So what is a commercial lease? A commercial lease is a lease of a property that is generally a business space, such as a warehouse, office space, retail store or restaurant. Rent for a commercial lease is usually based on the amount of square footage occupied by the tenant, and the tenant to a commercial lease may be required to pay a percentage of their profit earned on the property to the landlord. There are different types of commercial leases. In a triple net lease, the tenant pays for property expenses. These are the most common for retail properties, as operating expenses can be higher than for office space. Triple net leases are better for the landlord, as the tenant is responsible for any unexpected expenses, such as water damage, increased taxes, or increased power rates. In a gross lease, the landlord pays for all property expenses. The tenant only pays for each month's rent. The tenant need not worry about unexpected expenses and can focus on running their business. In a modified gross lease, the landlord and tenant share property expenses. For Don Curlehan's lease, our fictional client wishes to run their business, Don Curlehan's, a cafe bar, from an oceanfront property in California. They have found a property they like and have asked our firm to draft a commercial lease favorable to them to rent this property. What type of commercial lease do you think I should draft? And what terms or clauses would you consider to be the most important to include in this lease for our client, Don Curlehan? I chose a gross lease for this client. In this gross lease, I give the following clauses considerable contemplation to ensure that they are to the benefit of Don Curlehan. Who would pay for expenses and the utilities? And what would the permitted use be? Will there be an option to renew the lease? And can the leasee make alterations and improvements to the property? Who will be responsible for damage to the leased premises? Usually a landlord will pass on their property expenses to the tenant by including the expenses and utilities costs in the tenant's rent, or raising the rents as the expenses occur or increase. Under a gross lease, the landlord pays for any and all expenses, including taxes, insurance, utilities, and often repairs. For Don Curlehan's, the landlord will pay the expenses, including any utilities, maintenance, insurance, and taxes. What is the permitted use? A use clause clearly dictates what the tenant is and is not allowed to use the commercial space for. They also dictate how to handle disputes among commercial tenants if multiple tenants lease in the same building. They can be a limited use clause, which only allows for the tenant to use the space in its authorised capacity or articulates what specific uses the space can utilise. Or they can be a more general use clause, which provides more leeway for a tenant to conduct and grow their business. When drafting this provision, I thought about the many businesses that have been unable to make other use of their premises while workers are not allowed to be on site due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So many companies have adjusted to allowing their staff to work from home, and largely it has been proved that working from home is popular, feasible, and substantively more cost efficient for most companies. However, you will probably all know that companies are mandating that all workers should return to their offices as soon as government allows. This, I believe, is down to commercial leases. Businesses tied themselves into quite reasonable 5, 10 and 20-year leases of highly sought after office space all over the world. And when COVID-19 hit, their leases for the commercial space restricted them from releasing themselves from the lease or even making other use of the premises. Instead, they were forced to allow the premises to lie idle and to continue paying rent. And yet other businesses were able to repurpose their commercial space to continue to conduct their business. For example, while many workers had to work from home, their office buildings have sat empty and idle for over a year now, as the businesses were unable to make other use of the premises. Whereas many restaurants were able to repurpose and redecorate the outdoor areas of their premises and provide outdoor dining experiences for their customers. I believe the latter likely had more general use provisions in their commercial leases, which allowed them more leeway in conducting and growing their business. Nevertheless, I felt that specificity would be the best option for this clause in Don Curlehan's lease, as I believe the description given of the permitted use gives Don Curlehan's ample space to conduct their business. The next provision we will look at is the option to renew the lease. An option to renew provides the leasee with security and usually locks in a price in advance for both the landlord and the tenant. An option to renew provision must be explicitly included in the commercial lease. One of the most famous and interesting lease term provisions I have ever come across is that of Arthur Guinness and his 9,000-year lease for St James's Gate Brewery in Dublin, Ireland, where in 1759 he locked in an annual rent of £45, which would have condemned his descendants to death for thousands of years had the business failed. If you ever visit the Guinness factory in Dublin, you can view the 9,000-year lease, which is encased in a glass box in the floor of the brewery. For Don Curlehan's lease, I opted for a 5-year lease term with an option to renew for an additional 5 years at a rental price of £10,000 per month. I just wasn't as brave as Arthur Guinness. This means that if the business is going well at this location, coming toward the end of the 5-year lease term, that Don Curlehan's will have the option to renew their lease and keep their business at this location for an additional 5 years, and the rent will remain at £10,000 per month for the additional 5-year period. A new business has many considerations when creating an option to renew provision, and additional advice from either an economist or a real estate agent would best supplement an attorney's advice in relation to this provision. The next provision we will look at is alterations and improvements. This clause provides that prior consent of the landlord is required for alterations and improvements. This provision also provides for who owns the alteration or improvement and whether the lessee can take it with them when they leave. In John B. Keane's play The Field, this man, Bull McCabe's family, had rented a field for many generations and had cultivated and improved the land from barren to now very productive. Bull McCabe felt that he was entitled to ownership of the productiveness of the soil, as he was the one who had made the improvement to the rented land. In the alteration and improvements provision I chose for this client, it is provided for that in all cases of alterations, improvements, changes, accessories and the like that cannot be removed from the premises without destroying or otherwise deteriorating the premises or any surface thereof, shall upon creation become the leaseor's property without need for any further transfer, delivery or assignment thereof. While, like in Bull McCabe's situation, your emotions can often lead you to believe that a tenant who applies such an improvement to a premises should be entitled to ownership and subsequent removal of such improvements, it is important to remember to check what the contract provides for. For Don Curlehan, this means that the landlord will have ownership over any improvements that the tenant makes to the premises that cannot be removed without destroying or deteriorating the premises or any surface therein. Next, we will look at who is responsible for damage in a gross lease. Unless the lessee is at fault, the leaseor will pay for repairs. Of course, this must also be provided for in the lease. Unlike residential properties, a commercial landlord is not typically required to repair or maintain a commercial property for its tenants except as required by the lease. A duty to repair and maintain may be provided for in the lease or required by statute or by the implied warranty of habitability. The warranty of habitability generally is implied only in residential tenancies. In the lease of a commercial building, no duty arises under the theory of habitability. However, in a gross lease, a tenant negotiates a repair and maintenance clause to obligate the landlord to make repairs. For Don Curlehan's, this provision provides that the landlord would be required to pay for the remediation of any damage to the premises and that rent would be abated until the premises was restored to substantially the same condition in which it was handed over to the lessee. Despite what it says in this photo, all provisions are of consequence to a contract, and it is important to ensure that all provisions are in the best interests of your client, or at the very least that they are fair to your client. For example, in this lease I included a right of entry provision wherein the landlord must give the tenant 14 days notice before entering the premises to carry out inspections, repairs or alterations on the property. Some other provisions require that the lessee comply with the law and ensure that they obtain all pertinent licenses and permits relevant to their business, that they keep the premises clean and sanitary and conduct any minor repairs, and that they not assign, transfer or sublease their interest in the premises to another party. It is also important to include in the lease which state's laws will govern the contract because a dispute may hinge on differences in local laws. Finally, the lease must be signed to be enforceable. Under the statute of frauds, there are some types of agreements that have to be documented in a writing that is signed by the party who you are trying to enforce the agreement against. Under California law, a lease does have to be in writing to be enforceable, but only when the lease is for a period of more than 1 year. To enforce all of the provisions in this lease, our client, Don Curlehan, has to ensure that they have a copy of the lease signed by the landlord. Thank you for taking the time to review my presentation. If you have any questions or suggestions that you think could improve this commercial lease for the client, please do let me know in the comments.